I became kind of interested in Newtonian reflectors. I became actually quite obsessed with them. And this one's just a portable one here. But I want to tell you how this all began. A long time ago, sometime around, I don't know if it was 93 or 1993, 92, I was in a grocery market and there was a magazine that was talking about these comets that were going to hit Jupiter. And I remember pulling up that magazine and looking at it and saying, wow, this is incredible. I'd never seen anything like that. I heard about meteors hitting Earth in movies and things of that sort. But to actually know this was really going to occur and it could be witnessed by us through a telescope was just really intriguing to me. And I just became absolutely obsessed. I couldn't put it down. And it's been like a nonstop thing for me. So what happened was that I went to this place called Scope City where Jeff Wood used to work. Some of you may know him. And I used to go in and I had this old telescope that my brother had constructed in the late 70s. It was an old 6-inch Coulter telescope. And I tried to reassemble this old thing and put it together to see this event. And I configured this mount and needed a couple of little accessories. So I went into this Scope City shop in Sherman Oaks, California. And I saw this thing called a TELRAD. I didn't know what a TELRAD was. I'd never seen one, never heard of one. And I couldn't believe it. It looked like a little brick. I don't have one with me to show you. But Jeff told me, you got to put one of these things on here. And so I put one on my scope and I realized it's just so much easier to find things with it. Because prior to that, I didn't have a mount or anything. I would lean the telescope on a couch and just try to point it at things. And I couldn't even see, I didn't even have a finder scope. In fact, I didn't even know, there was two eyepieces that it had. It said K12 and K25. I didn't know what that meant. And I later found out it meant Kellner. And so I actually didn't realize there were other eyepieces other than Kellner's. So I went in and to Scope City and I saw all these eyepieces and all this stuff. And I said, oh my gosh, there's a lot of stuff here. So I just became obsessed with this stuff. And Jeff told me there's a place that you could go observing. So I went up to Mount Pinos, this is the early 90s. And I met all these people that were up there and I was like, wow, this is crazy. These people are like really into this. And it was very intoxicating and it was just a new adventure for me. And so what I decided to do was to eventually get a telescope. So I went and bought one from Jeff. It was an 8-inch Meade Schmidt-Cassegrain. It's called the 2080B. It was kind of funny because back then, the B, there was an A and a B. One meant that you had coatings on both sides of the glass, and one meant that you had coatings on one side. Nevertheless, I got the telescope, and I spent a lot of time with it, for quite a few years with it. And I learned to star hop with it. It had an equatorial wedge. It didn't have a computer or anything like that, so you had to find things. So I'd attach the TELRAD to it and find things that way. But what really changed me, there was a guy named Dan that had an Astrophysics 4-inch Traveler. It's this small telescope that Astrophysics made. And during this period of time in the mid-90s, I remember looking at Jupiter through my 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain and through that little Traveler. And I couldn't believe that I was actually seeing more detail on Jupiter's surface in that little telescope than in my 8-inch. I later come to realize that maybe the 8-inch that I had wasn't great. Maybe that was the issue. I don't know. I've tested other Schmidt-Cassegrains, you know, to this day that are much better than the one I had. But nevertheless, it started something that I couldn't stop and became obsessed. And so I took this Traveler and spent some time viewing with it with Dan there. And I met this other guy. His name was Vernon Kiefer. And it was really funny. I'll never forget Vernon. He actually looked like Carl Sagan. He had this sport coat on. It was kind of a beige color, and he had this turtleneck. And so I walked up to him, and I said, you know, you look like Carl Sagan. And it was kind of funny, and we struck up this conversation. Well, in the Backyard Astronomer's Guide, you know, back in that time, we didn't have all these refractors that we have now. Now, the market is just saturated and filled with all types of different refractors. And we didn't have those back then, all that selection. So if you had opened the Backyard Astronomer's Guide, they would tell you about maybe a Nikon or a Zeiss or a Takahashi. So they were talking about how expensive these telescopes were, and I just was like, wow, God, nobody has one. Nobody at Mount Pinos had one. So Vernon was the first person at Mount Pinos who I'd ever seen who had a Takahashi scope. And I was really curious about them because they were very expensive, and it was just so exciting to see one. And the only company that had one was that I knew at the time that was distributing them was called F.C. Meisner Company, which had long gone out of business, but some people may remember. So I talked to Vernon about trying to get one. Met this guy named Dan Gordon at a business called Spectra Astro Systems in the Valley, and I bought my first refractor from him. I hadn't had hardly any money. I had to buy a Mounsey GM8 mount with just analog, these setting circles where you just attach a digital setting circle box and add encoders to it. And I learned a lot, not just from the 8-inch SCT I had, but with the refractors that I had. So anyway, I had met Vernon, and this had to be at some time, I think, in the early 90s or mid-90s, and he had this refractor. I was checking out this 5-inch Tak, and I remember seeing this 5-inch Takahashi. And I remember saying to myself, God, I'd never seen one. I just wanted to see it, and so we struck up a conversation and whatnot. There was also another individual. His name was Darren Bly, and Darren Bly was just really blew me away because he had this old 17.5-inch Coulter at one point that he was viewing with in the mid-90s. I think he got it in 95, 94, 95, somewhere around that time, I think. And we were looking, and I remember Darren Bly had these books, and he was opening, he had these books and list of deep sky objects, and he was discussing, I said, what are these books? What are you doing here? And he's like, well, I'm going through this list of NGC objects. And I said, what is this book? He said, it's called Burnham Celestial Handbook. I said, oh, that's interesting. So he was going down the list of all these objects that he wanted to see in this 17.5-inch scope, and I remember seeing a galaxy in the thing, and I said, wow, it's brighter than my 8-inch Schmidt cast. I can see how light can really make things look up here brighter to your eyes, But I somehow got gravitated to these refractors and decided to spend time listening to what Vernon had to tell me. And he was kind of took me under his wing, and I just kind of listened to everything he said. And he had been doing it longer than I had, and he had a good amount of money and had nice things. So eventually after a couple of years went by, he said, look, there's a spot that, but I prefer that you don't tell people about it, that I go to, that we just don't want a lot of people to go to because we want to keep it kind of low key because it's nice and quiet and you can really concentrate. And he said the place is called Charlton Flats. So I went to Charlton Flats with him, and nobody was there. It was just he and I. We would set up scopes, and I had this little Takahashi refractor. And I remember going up there, and the first thing that really shocked me was how stable the air was. I remember being at Pinos, and I remember there being so much scintillating and so much air movement. It was darker at Pinos and very transparent, but the air was just not as still. And so when you looked at the colors of stars or you looked at the planets, they were just a lot more still in the eyepiece. And it really shocked me, and it really blew me away. So I just ended up becoming obsessed with this. And I think this had to be in the mid to later 90s as it progressed. And he had his 5-inch refractor, and I had my 4-inch Tak. I was so excited to have one finally. I could, scrounged up enough change to afford one, and I had it on my little GM8. And I remember, you see, the Losmani GM8s had stepper motors. If you had the regular non-go-to systems that we have today, the airy discs, when you looked at stars, you could actually see the pulsations of those airy discs through the eyepiece. It was really startling to me. And you can see these little pulses, ting, 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 ting. Because stepper motors, they go ting, 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 ting. And you could actually see the airy disc and the stars up there pulsing with it. And we would literally spend hours on end. We would go up very routinely And Vernon and I would view the planets in these binocular viewers. And I couldn't afford one. He had a nice binocular viewer from Teleview, and then he later got this Zeiss binocular viewer. And I was just envious of all these nice things and you know, that he was able to acquire, and just having the opportunity to use it and play with it. And I remember just even those 4-inch refractors and the 5 inches, we were using magnifications anywhere from, say, 150 to 250x to look at Jupiter and Saturn. And I just remember seeing so much incredible detail on Jupiter. I mean, we could see colors and belts, and we saw these transits and these ingresses and egresses, and you know, all these shadow transits and these moons transiting across. It was just so mind-boggling to me. And then we saw moons coming out of shadows because of this thing known as quadrature, where you have the Earth and Jupiter and the Sun at 90-degree angles. They call it quadrature. And I remember staring at you know, the moons just come out of the shadows out of nowhere in the middle of space. It was just so astonishing to me. And I realized that when you sit for hours on end and you're just staring in these binocular viewers, and because I eventually got one, that you just see so much detail. It isn't really so much just, you know, getting this telescope or getting that telescope. It's really just sitting down and being patient and just looking at this stuff. It was just so mind-boggling to me. Later, some different nights that Vernon had gone up, there was another group of people. A guy named Ed Ziccardi, Philo, George Acklich, there was John Pons and Ed Grissom. And these guys were all using optimized Newtonians. Now, I had never seen through optimized Newtonians, and optimized Newtonians meant that they were using these cheap cardboard sonotubes and curved spiders. So I remember going up and looking through these telescopes up there, and I just dropped my jaw in disbelief, because I thought when I owned a refractor, I kind of was done with all this, you know, reaching the maximum, you know, resolution, or, you know, I was still learning stuff. And then I looked in these 8-inch Newtonians. There were f8s, f6s, f10s, just 8 inches of aperture. Some were 10. There were some that were 12 and a half. There was one that was 16. There was one that was 13. And when I saw the images in those scopes, I was so blown away at how incredible the details in the planets were, and all the linear striations in Saturn's ring divisions, and the belts on Jupiter were so mesmerizing, and Mars, and I just became obsessed with Newtonian reflectors. So I went on to this quest where I was just obsessed with trying to understand how they were achieving these beautiful images. And I learned a lot of stuff from John Pons and Ed Grissom. John Pons is a very eccentric individual. People that know him know he's really crazy, but some people call him Crazy Pons. But everybody's different in this hobby. Everybody's, you know, it's like artists. You have to deal with certain things to, you know, to learn things. So I had to learn, and I listened. And I listened to Pons, as crazy as he was, and Ed Grissom was kind of a humble guy and a little different. But regardless of all that, just the information that was coming out of this guy was just crazy. So Grissom had these fans that he put behind the telescope, and he was adamant that you had to have clearance around the primary substrate, the primary mirror, so that when the fans were pushing air through the back, it was sort of vortexing through the sonotube. And it's kind of like pulls everything to the side and just flushes it out the top. So I wrote this review on cloudy nights called Refractor versus Reflector. And that's when I started dabbling into testing fan configurations on the front and sides and rear and things of that sort. But it was really something. And so I ended up getting a reflector. So one of my first high-end reflectors was a 10-inch teleport by Tom Noe in Texas, Wiley, Texas. And I had to wait, you know, about a year for that telescope. And, you know, good things, you got to wait for them, and that's just how it is. And I remember taking that up there, and I know the first thing you notice with Newtonians is color. You see more color on the surfaces with the increased aperture. You see more color saturation on the planets. So sometimes the images kind of fuzz in and out. They weren't as consistent sometimes as the refractors, and part of that is due to the thermals and things called boundary layers and all these weird things that you have to learn about. So I had to learn all those things. For me, everything I had to learn backwards. I didn't learn it going forwards. Everything was backwards. It was like I had to observe it and then find references that could explain it. Whereas a lot of people on cloudy nights, for example, they parrot a lot of things that they read, but they don't actually experience it. And for me, it was just the opposite. I had to experience it and then find references that pertain to it so I could learn a little bit more about it. So a lot of the things that I learned was from listening to teachers, from the guys that had mentored and schooled me, and then trying to apply it and share it with others to try and help them understand it. And so it's just this constant learning process, and it never seems to end, and there's just no end to it. As you know, a lot of history came from Mount Wilson. Charlton Flats is behind Mount Wilson. It's about 10 miles further up Angeles Crest Highway. And what's so incredible is you really do, you do experience sub-arc second seeing conditions where you can literally split sub-arc second stars with various telescopes, that have the resolving power to do it. So it was just such a great experience there. So what's really happening, what's so bizarre about Mount Wilson, is that even though, back in the time when they were putting the 100-inch telescope up there, they didn't, predict, I guess, all this light pollution that we would have. But I later came to find out that that light pollution would have benefits, believe it or not. So what happens is that where Mount Wilson is positioned, if you have a prevailing wind that's moving from southwest to northeast, you're going to get, that's the ideal direction that you want air to move. So you get that onshore airflow coming in towards the face of the mountain. And what happens is you get this inversion layer over the city. It basically traps everything and keeps just that nice flow coming over. And it's part of the reason why you get such good seeing there. It's not always that you get good seeing. It depends on the season and the time. But typically it's just incredible. For example, for every 10 nights I went to Charlton Flats, I would get 9 nights that were just like ideal for me, that were just incredible. Pinos, by comparison, it was just, I hardly had nights where the seeing was as good. Granted, it was a little bit higher altitude, a little bit darker, of course, by comparison. Nevertheless, the prevailing wind and that cool ocean onshore air is what helps make Charlton so incredible. And you're probably wondering what happened to Charlton. At some time, there was a forest fire. And after that forest fire, some of the trees became brittle. And sadly, they had to close Charlton Flats. I can't remember if it was in the mid-2000s. It was some time ago. And it really broke everything up. It hurt everything I was doing, and we couldn't get together. We couldn't view anymore. And it was really such a sacred place to me. It still is to this day. And we just can't go there anymore. It's typically fenced off, and it's gated, so we can't really get in there anymore. And there's this friend from Cloudy Nights, Lou Chilton, and he's been going there since the 60s. So he showed me some pictures of him at Charlton Flats from the 60s. And he had these old, I think they were cave Newtonians or some crazy thing, these old Newtonian reflectors on these equatorial piers and whatnot. So anyway, I just wanted to give you guys kind of an introduction into my history and how this all began and how it's continued on. And a lot has gone on, whether it was eyepiece reviews that we were doing for Cloudy Nights, or if it was about Newtonian reflectors or optimizing them. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the telescopes here behind me and about this one here, and go into some details about that, but at least you have some idea about me and how I got into this hobby itself. So.